Good morning, grade fives. It is Thursday, almost the weekend, and then you can relax. I am so glad to be with you again today. And to start off our lesson, I'm going to give you another joke. And yes, by the end of this, you're probably going to be sick and tired of my jokes, or you're going to love my jokes. But it is such a great way to smile and start your day and laugh. And remember, smiles are infectious, which means if you smile and you smile at somebody else, the smile starts to spread. And so we are going through a bit of a difficult time as a nation and as, and throughout the world, but we're all in this together. And so let's continue to smile and see the positive sides of things that are happening, and just try and just take one day at a time. So, are you ready for my joke? Okay, so what do you give a sick lemon? You give him a lemonade. Get it? Like a band-aid, but a lemonade, like the... I always feel like I need to explain the joke just in case some of you don't get it, because I want you all to get it and have a laugh. And either you're going to be laughing at me and how lame I am, even though I have to explain it, or you're laughing at the joke. Either way, you're smiling, and that's all that matters. So, I think enough of my silliness. Let's begin. Right. Remember that this lesson is brought to you by WorksheetCloud, and if you've got any questions throughout the lesson, email them to grade5@worksheetcloud.com. Today, we are going to go on a journey, and we are going to look at creative writing and the tips for creative writing. And so I thought of doing this lesson because now is the time more than any time that you're at home, you're alone with your thoughts, and you have the ability to properly use your imagination and write about all kinds of things using all types of language, skills and techniques that you've learned so far in English. And so that's why I want to go through the different tips for creative writing. But before I do, I want to read an extract from Harry Potter. I enjoyed reading all the Harry Potter books. Every single book I was captured. I felt like I was there at Hogwarts. I enjoyed the movies, but I won't lie, I preferred the books better. I preferred the books more. I prefer reading. And so I thought that a lot of you can relate to Harry Potter, or at least you've either read Harry Potter, or you've heard of him, or you've watched the movie. But I want to read an extract from the beginning of the book. And throughout this lesson and the different components of creative writing, I am going to continually reference or come back to aspects of this particular piece. So this is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, written by J.K. Rowling. And this is chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted. But they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never even seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with the child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. Right. Don't you just love Harry Potter? It just takes you into like a world and your mind starts to just imagine, and the gift of imagination is priceless and nobody can ever take your imagination away from you. Okay, so let's have a look. So our lesson objectives today is that we are going to look at the beginning or the introduction of creative writing, of writing. We're going to be looking at main characters and the components of main characters, the middle or the body of your writing. We're going to be looking at the resolution or conclusion. And then to end off this lesson, I'm going to present an activity that all of you can do at home, and for you to use your imaginations and for you to just write. And I think that you'll enjoy it. Right. So starting off now, whenever we describe creative writing, we always refer to it as either a delicious sandwich or a juicy hamburger, because just like a sandwich and a hamburger, there's different parts of a sandwich and a hamburger. And it is important to look at writing like that as well. Writing isn't just writing. There's also different parts and components of writing. So with our sandwich, we start off with the first piece of bread on top, and that would, if we were to refer that to creative writing or link it, that would be our introduction of our writing. Then we move on to the body or the middle part of our sandwich, and you can see that in the body of our story as well, we also talk about having different subheadings. So subheading 1, subheading 2, and these would come into the forms of different paragraphs within the body. Just like a sandwich as well, you can see that the filling in a sandwich, what I can see, lettuce, cheese, ham, tomato, there's many different fillings within the actual sandwich and within the body of the sandwich. Just like a hamburger, patty, cheese, tomato, sauce, gherkins, whatever. Maybe you like Hawaiian and you like the pineapple ring, whatever you want. The body consists of many different subheadings as well. And then lastly, to end off our delicious sandwich, is the second piece of bread to sort of wrap it up. And that is where in writing we talk about the conclusion or the resolution of our writings, to sort of wrap up our story or wrap up that part of the story. So even the same with Harry Potter as well, it starts a certain way, then there is a middle that you saw of a few different paragraphs, and then it ends in a certain way, and then it ends in a question, and so it gets you thinking. And so you want to read more, or you want to, your mind already starts to imagine what's going to happen with that owl. Right, so let's start off with the introduction. Now, your introduction is one of the most important, because your introduction should grab your reader's attention for them to continue reading. This is where you want it to be so exciting that you want your readers to, oh, I want to read more. What is going to happen? Or this sounds quite interesting. Let's learn more about these characters. Or maybe your introduction is about a setting or a scene, and oh, I want to read more about this forest that is mysterious and dark, and or whatever the case. And so your introduction is there to capture the reader's attention. The characters, if you're going to introduce your characters in your introduction, it should be kept to a minimum. Remember, you don't want an introduction in your story that if you're introducing your characters, you don't want so many characters that as a reader, you start getting lost. Now you can't remember which character had this name, which character wore this, which character was the grumpy one, and so you want to try and keep it as to a minimum as possible. Bring your characters to life through detailed description of their personality and appearance. And so remember, when we introduce our characters, and I'm going to talk about main characters in our next slide, but when we talk about our characters, remember, we want to talk about their personality, their appearance. What was so beautiful with the way that J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter is that you saw in the introduction of chapter 1, we were introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. And immediately, the way that she was able to describe Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley, from her appearance to even her personality, how she has a longer neck, because what does she do? She sticks her head over the neighbor's gate to try and spy and gossip and whatnot. And so immediately we have an idea, and we've got this vision of Mrs. Dursley in our mind, and Mr. Dursley, and also how she uses, when she explains Mr. Dursley in the introduction, she explains that he's a little bit plump, he's got no neck, and even towards the end, not in the introduction, but towards the end, and then the way that she says how he picks another boring work tie, then immediately you start to think, okay, so he pretty much wears the same sort of clothing every day. The life, it's quite a monotonous daily routine almost. And so it is so important that when we introduce characters, and what J.K. Rowling did so brilliantly as well is that she only introduced the 2 characters, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. And so there wasn't everybody there in the story. We started off with 2, so we could focus on 2, and then throughout the story of Harry Potter, we then are introduced to many more characters. We are able to create interaction between characters. What is their relationship? And what was so great with Mr. and Mrs. Dursley is that we know exactly what their relationship is. We know not only their appearance and their personality, but how they interact with one another. Also, how they view their son. Their son is the greatest son in the world. Nobody's better than their son, Dudley. Something also has to happen in your story. Okay, so what exactly is the problem? So when we talk about a creative writing in our story, they will also present a problem. Now, your problem can either come in your introduction, or it can also come into the middle or the body of your story, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then usually when we finish off our story, our problem is then resolved. So what I'm discussing now is just sort of a summary of creative writing, with how we start with our introduction, then we have our body, then we've got our conclusion in our body, or towards, I would say, the end of your introduction, you can also bring your problem into play. We are also introduced to characters either in our introduction or in our body, or it's a continuation more or less. And then to finish off, there's either the problem is resolved, or there's a twist in the problem or the story that then it's almost like you want to carry on reading. So let's have a look specifically at all of that. The key thing about creative writing is that planning. You cannot just pick up a pen and start writing. You actually have to plan. What are you going to say in your introduction? What are you going to say in your body? What are you going to say in your conclusion? What is going to be your little headings of each? What words are you going to use? What adjectives? What figures of speech? Are you going to use similes, metaphors? What are your characters like? Let's describe your characters. What are their personalities? What is their appearance? What is the setting of your story? And so on. So planning is key. Right, let's have a look. Now, in your introduction, your story can begin in a variety of ways. So let's have a look at some examples. Right, so example 1, I can start off a story and it can start off and say, don't move, it's coming towards you. Now, if I start a story like that, don't move, it's coming towards you. Now, if you're a reader and you read that as the opening line, I guarantee you are going to read further, because you want to find out what is coming towards them. The writer's already established sort of a mood or an atmosphere about the story. And this is an awesome opening for almost like an adventure story. So don't move, it's coming towards you. Immediately we want to find out, what is it? What is it? It's coming towards you. What's going to happen? Is it a creature? Is it a person? Is it something mysterious? Is it magical? I immediately, in my mind, I'm picturing something magical because, and that would tie in with a beautiful adventure story. Okay, an example 2, another way to open or introduce creative writing. The girl slowly turned and gasped in horror. So that's what I'm picturing. And so again, we're in tune with the story. That opening line, the girl slowly turned and gasped. What did she gasp in horror? What did she see? Is there a twist? What type of story is this? Is this going to be a sort of a horror type story? Is there going to be a twist that as she turned around and then she saw a friend and then, that's great. What exactly is going to happen with that opening line? Then a third example is, it says, the first place that I can well remember was a large, pleasant meadow with a pond of clear water in it. Some shady trees leaned over it and rushes and water lilies grew at the deep end. Now, this opening begins with the description of a scene. A clear picture is painted and visualized. So let's just look at the beautiful parts of speech here and the way that the language is used in the adjectives. There was a large, pleasant meadow. There wasn't just a meadow. It was large. It was pleasant. If something is pleasant, it's happy. It's got that sort of warm, uplifting mood. There is a pond of clear water. It's not dirty. It's not messy. It's clear water. There are shady trees. Some shady trees leaned over it. Now, do shady trees actually lean, should I say? No, because so there is a personification over there, giving it a human quality of leaning over. And rushes and water lilies grew at the deep end. So this is a beautiful opening of a writing piece that actually opens with the start of a scene, pretty much. Okay, so there is various different ways of introducing particular stories. Let's have a look at some more. So example 3, Granny Smith, an ordinary little old white-haired lady resting on a seat in a public park, began to feel decidedly peculiar. Granny Smith was old and her eyesight and hearing were not as good as they used to be. So this is a story where it begins with the description of one of the possible main characters. And again, very similarly to Harry Potter, we start to visualize and get an image of this little old lady, Granny Smith. We visualize that she's old because it's describing her as old. It's mentioning that her eyesight and her hearing was not as good as what they used to be. So immediately I'm picturing her wearing glasses. She's sitting on a seat in a public park. And so this is a beautiful way also to introduce the story, introducing it with a main character, which is also, it's captivating, it uses your imagination, and again, it wants you reading more. And the fourth example is, the Iron Man came to the top of the cliff. How far had he walked? Nobody knew. Where had he come from? Nobody knew. How was he made? Nobody knew. So now this story begins with a straightforward sentence, and then it's followed by a list of questions aimed at getting the reader to think. And it's such a clever way of writing, because it says you the Iron Man came to the top of a cliff. How far had he walked? Immediately as the reader, you picturing he has walked very far. Nobody knew. Where had he come from? Nobody knew. How was he made? Nobody knew. So it's also, it creates a sense of mystery as well, and further questioning. You as a reader in your mind, you're asking all these questions. Now, do you see all these different examples of how you can introduce a creative writing? Introduce it with the main characters, introduce it with descriptions of scenery, introduce it of asking questions, introduce it with something completely wild that you just want to continue reading more. And so your introduction, this is where you want to capture the reader's attention, right? Now, remember, you can begin your story in different ways. It all depends on the type of story you want to create. Okay, so maybe by beginning in the middle of an action, So maybe you want to start your story as if you are James Bond and you are now in the casino and you're fighting off the bad guys, and that is you're going to introduce it like that. So it could be at the beginning, or it could be at the middle of an action. You could start it off by describing the setting as we saw one of the examples. You could start it mysteriously by asking questions as we saw with that Iron Man. Or you can start it by describing the main character and introducing your characters. So there's various different ways of starting your creative writing. Now, if we move on to our main characters, remember that there shouldn't, in your story, now remember when I'm talking about creative writing, I'm talking about short pieces. Later on, as you get older, you will be doing longer pieces that you can introduce and have more characters. But when we talk about short pieces now, when I say short pieces, I'm talking about 1 to 2 pages of writing. Possibly, I wouldn't go further than that at grade 5. So 1 to 2 pages of writing, maybe 2.5 if you're feeling more adventurous. But remember, it's important to have quality over quantity. So rich, beautiful, imaginative, creative work as opposed to just waffling on for 2.5 pages. Okay, so no more than 2 main characters. Other characters can be mentioned in your story, but it is important to fully develop your main characters and bring them to life, right? Describe your characters from their personalities, their appearance, some of their strengths and weaknesses, etc. So remember, we saw that, and then I explained with the characters of Mr. and Mrs. Dursley that we saw in Harry Potter. Interact your characters with each other. How are they related? What is their relationship? Do they have a relationship? Do they know each other? Maybe they don't even know each other at all, and they're meeting for the first time. Okay, now, so that is our characters. We've looked at our introduction. Now the middle or the body of your story. Okay, so something important needs to happen here. This is the part of the story. Your reader is now, you've introduced your story. Your reader is now intrigued and wants to read more. Okay, but now as they're reading more, you don't want to lose them now. You don't want it to waffle now that now the reader's like, oh, okay, well, I can't be bothered really to read the rest of the story. So you want to still capture that attention, but you want something sort of exciting to happen. So either you can build up to a climax of some kind, and then something happens, a problem happens, and then eventually we find a solution, but something important needs to happen here. This is where the problem of your story lies. You can have subtopics within your body that can build up to the problem. And so this is where you can also have your various paragraphs. And remember that this is, again, I'm referring back to planning. It's so important to plan your story so that in your planning, you can then have an effective body. What are you going to have in all of your topics as well, or your subheadings within your middle or your body? And I would say that if you're going to have subtopics, keep them to about 2 to 3 paragraphs. I wouldn't go more than that, because remember, we are talking about short stories, 2 to 3 paragraphs within, say, 1 page. If you're going to write a little bit longer or a little bit more, so if you're doing 2 pages or 2.5 pages, then you can have a few more sort of paragraphs or subtopics as well. Okay, now we've come to the end of our writing. So now how are we going to wrap up our creative writing? How are we going to solve whatever problem there was that we read in the body or the middle of our story? And remember, we want to wrap up the story in a certain way that we still want to sort of capture the audience's attention. We want to either leave them guessing, we want to get them thinking. So there's also various techniques in which we can also wrap up stories. So again, as I've mentioned, this is where the problem is solved. So when the problem was introduced or mentioned in the body or the middle of our story, now we want to end it off. We want to resolve the problem. The ending can be happy or sad. Again, it depends on what the mood of your story is, what type of story you are writing, and it can end in a variety of ways, just like the start of a story. Right, the resolution or conclusion depends on the type of story or genres that you have chosen. So like I said, all depending on what type of story you've chosen, it can also end in a certain way. if you have got a generally happy story, it can end happy. If you've got a very realistic story, it can maybe start off sort of sad, end off happy, or vice versa. Whatever the case is, it all depends on the type of story and genre that you have decided to write. Okay, now let's have a look at examples. So this is one example of how we can end off a story. The boys wondered if life would ever be the same again. So this is ending off the story in a question. And again, it's getting you to question, what would life be? Well, the boys wondered if life would ever be the same again. Thinking. Another example, the girl knew that she had learned her lesson of always being honest. And so this is like a moralistic way to end a story of learning lessons, maybe ending off with a moral of a lesson of a creative writing, which is also relevant because you also want your reader to relate to your story, because when you write a story, you've got a target audience for your story. Who do you want to read your story? Do you want a teenager to read your story? Do you want an adult to read it? Do you want maybe a boy or girl your age? Maybe you want a friend to read it. Who is the audience of your particular story? Okay, now the most important thing as well is that you must remember to always include detail, description, and build up that atmosphere when you sort of end off your story. Right, now it is your turn. So now you are going to get the chance to do your own creative writing. And this is your chance to use your imagination. You've been blessed with the best gift in the world, and that's your imagination. Nobody can take that away from you. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a prompt, and then you are going to decide where it's going to fit into your narrative. This piece or this prompt can be in the beginning, middle, or the end of your story. You're then going to write one section of your story incorporating the prompt below. So what I would suggest, I'm going to give you the prompt now, and wherever we're going to read the prompt together, and you can decide, okay, I want this prompt to be in the introduction of my story, or this prompt is going to be somewhere in the body, and then I'm going to work my story around this prompt, or this prompt's going to be towards the end of my story and in my conclusion, and then I'm going to write the story, and then it's going to conclude with the prompt. So this is also a different way of creative writing, where I give you a sentence or a prompt, and then you develop a story around the prompt, and then you can decide where do you want your prompt to go, in the beginning, the middle, or the end. Right, so the prompt is: the dogs watched silently as the man strode out the door, jumped into his car, and drove off. Right, said the tabby briskly, the human's gone, let's get started. Okay, so that's quite cute. That immediately, for those of you that have seen the movie The Secret Life of Pets, that's what springs to mind. That's exactly what I'm thinking. So now is your turn to write your own story. I hope that you are as creative as possible. Remember to use different parts of speech, different figures of speech. Really think about your language. Think about all the components that we've spoken about today, your characters, your introduction, your middle, your conclusion, and grab the audience's attention. And remember, quality over quantity. Don't waffle and waffle and waffle. Be descriptive, use your imagination. And when you show your creative writing to somebody else, I hope that their mind starts to just go onto a magical journey as they read your piece. Today was a fun lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that your mind is all over the show. Have a wonderful day further, and I shall see you all tomorrow. Hakuna Matata, grade 5s, and remember, be kind to one another. Bye.